Tonight I want to talk to you, and I've called tonight's topic. The topic is transition, but what I really want to speak to you about is how we walk through changes in our lives, because all of us are walking through things that change all the time. And sometimes when we come up against these changes, we don't know what to do and we don't know how to get through it. And some of these things can freak us out, and other things we can just get through smoothly. But I want to talk to you about changes, and I want to talk to you about transition. Now, one of the things that inspired this message is at conference, which is our state conference for this particular movement of INC. We went to conference a couple of months back, just before I went on long service, and we spoke to the powers to be, the oversight down there. And at that conference, we talked about the transition of senior pastoring from Cherie and I being transitioned over to Sam and Kirsty. And that is a big deal for Cherie and I, who have been here for, coming on 25 years next year as the senior leaders. It's also a big deal for Sam and Kirsty as they start to grow and develop into that role. It's also a big deal for the church that could have been here because they really felt they wanted to serve God through me and through Cherie and through this ministry of this church. Then there'll be other people that are really glad that now they can serve through Sam and Kirsty's ministry through this church, serve God through them, and everywhere in between. And I wanted to chat about that today, but it's not about that announcement. It's about transition and just changing and things changing in general. So over the next 12 months, you will see Cherie and I and Sam and Kirsty walk through this transition. And the one thing I ask on this point is that you can give us grace to walk through this as seamless as possible and as easy as possible. But I want to emphasize the word transition. This is not happening overnight. This is not happening immediately. It's not happening already, but it is a transition. And I hope that it's a good transition that is going to see this church go into the next decade or two with God. Now, the best way that I can explain a good transition is by demonstrating it through what you'd call a relay race. Has anybody ever seen the Olympics where they're running a relay race around the track and they've got the baton that they have to get from the beginning to the end of the race? Has anybody ever seen that? Yeah, you've seen that. And what happens is that one person is running, and this can happen a number of times throughout the race, but one person is running with the baton and they are running as hard as they can. They are running as fast as they can. And the next person is just sort of looking back and sort of watching what's happening and seeing, who's coming up behind them, and sort of, as they get closer, they start to get ready. And then when the person that is running flat out gets to the right point, the other person starts to run as well. Then there's two people running. One's running as fast as he can with the baton, and the other person doesn't have the baton, but he's starting to really pick up some speed, and he's really starting to get going. Now, a good transition happens when the first runner is running as hard and as fast as they can with the baton, but the person who's just about to take the baton is also got their speed up to absolute maximum revs of their little legs, that is, going forward, and the baton is passed when both of them are running as fast as they can. Straight after that has happened, then the one with the baton starts to run really, as hard as they can, longer, and start to do their leg of the race, and the other person doesn't just stop because they just fall over, but they would start to just slow down their jogging and until they do stop. One day they'd stop, and the other person takes it on until when there's another baton change. That is what is called transitioning the baton in a relay race of how to go forward. And a good transition of any type, and I'm going to talk about quite a few of them today to get your head around this. A good transition has those things in it. They have the one person running hard with the next person ready to go. They have both people running hard, then they have one that will continue on as the other starts to slow down. That is the seamless and best way and quickest way to pass the baton to win the race, whether it's a race or whether it's a church going into another decade or whether it's just something that's happening to you personally. And that is a smooth way of doing it. You know, in the Bible, God transitioned an entire nation, the nation of Israel. He took them from being in bondage in Egypt, and for those that don't understand this or may not, have a clear picture of what it was like for that nation to be in bondage under the Egyptian rule, is that they were slaves. They were not allowed to love God. They were not allowed to practice their own religion. They weren't allowed to pretty well do anything. They were literally slaves, and they were made to do what the Egyptians said. And God said, I'm going to transition this entire nation of people that I love, and I'm going to transition them into the promised land. But it wasn't just they were in Egypt one day and then the next day they were in the promised land that God had given them. There was what we had was the 10 plagues. And while those Israelites were still under that bondage of Egypt, there was the 10 plagues that came, onto that land. And that was softening the heart of Pharaoh to get ready to let those people go. There was also the people getting ready to go, but they still weren't gone. And then even when they did go after those 10 plagues, they then wandered in the desert, and there was 40 years of transition between being in bondage under the Egyptians and, of course, the freedom that God wanted them to have in the promised land. 40 years of transition. I hope that this transition with Sam and Kirsten doesn't take 40 years. I ain't got 40 years left in me. I'm telling you that now. But that was a transition that happened. And not only did it at a 40-year transition, but Moses started that, and then it was Joshua that took them into the promised land. There was a transitional stage for the people. There was a transitional stage in leadership, but there was something that God was doing from the very beginning of how he got them into Egypt to the very end of where he got them out of Egypt and had them where he wanted them to go. You see, this is my question for you. We live in an instantaneous generation where it's drive-through McDonald's and it's drive-through KFC and it's in the microwave and in 3 minutes it's done, and if it's any longer then it's just not going to happen. But how many things have we missed out on because we weren't willing to walk through a good transition of where God wanted to take us? What about the plans that God had for you, but the transition of getting you ready for that plan took too long? So then you just stop, and then you just don't go any further. Or then you just say, this is too hard, I can't do this. I mean, there is so many things that walk in this topic, and I really want to help us walk through whatever God is transitioning us through as both a church, as both people, as individuals. And I want to throw a couple of them out. Let me give you a couple of things that are fairly difficult to work through. And you've got to think transition, not event. Because if you just think this is just going to happen overnight, these things could undo very, very quickly. Let me give you one. Here's a transition. Going from unmarried to married. There you go. Oh, wow, that's a funny one to start with, because don't you just sort of find someone and then you walk down the aisle and then you get married at the altar, and then when you leave, you're a married person, and then everything's perfect from that day onwards. Being unmarried and then being married is a 40-year transition. I'm making that up because that's what it took the guys to get out of Egypt into the promised land. But it could be a 40-year transition. As a very minimum, it's probably a 4-year transition. I remember when I married Cherie, and she's sitting down here on the front row looking as good as ever with a mask on. And we decided to get married, and it was just rainbows and butterflies all the way until we moved into the same house in the same bedroom. That was a transitional period, that one. Give yourself time. It's like that relay race. I was living my own life and doing my own thing and driving my own car, and she was doing her own thing, working her own job, driving her own car, and then all of a sudden we got married, and then we only had one car, and one job, one house, and one bed. It's going to take some time to work some stuff out. And we've got to think, God, what am I transitioning into? Because if we don't realize it's a transition and it's going to be a good transition from being single to being married, you might jump out way before you're supposed to because it may be God's best for your life, but you didn't understand transition. You didn't understand that things had to change a little bit for this transition to happen. Yeah, I'll give you another one. This is just another one. I'm looking at my list going, what the heck was I doing when I was writing this list? But this is a transition that some go through, and I'm going to say it for whether you're here today or watching online, but some people go from married to unmarried. That's a tough transition. I mean, it could be because someone's died. I know people that have had partners that have been together for years and years and years, and one of them has passed away, and now they're single, and they're used to having two people in the one house and the one car and the one bed. And now there's just one person. And that's a tough transition. And I'm not saying all transitions are good and all transitions are going to make you happy, but if you don't walk through those transitions in life, you can easily find yourself in a place that's dark and it's not where God wants you to be. God has everything in his hands, and we're constantly walking through transitions all the time. And some of them are tough, but give yourself some room to be able to walk through some of these transitions that happen to us with getting married or being unmarried or getting remarried or whatever it might be. Because these things don't just change overnight. And God, he wants to be with us all the way. He wants to be there when you walk down the aisle, and he wants to be there when you go home together, and he wants to be there when one day you go home by yourself. He wants to be there with every transition, whether it's in a church or in your life or in your personal or whatever it might be. Things change. And we've got to be people that understand the word transition and understand the word change, because if we don't, we can freak out and implode. Here's one. Having kids. Wow. A transition from having two people that are married to then two people that are married with a kid. That's a bigger transition than just getting married. I mean, those babies that come out, I mean, they can ruin your night. They can ruin your social life. They can ruin where you go. They can ruin where you're not going. They can make you late. They can poop in the car. They can poop anywhere. They can just poop. These getting used to this transition of raising a child. Listen, if you happen to find yourself with a brand new baby and it's your first one, second one, third one, fifth one, it doesn't matter what it is, give yourself some grace to transition into being a great mum or a great dad. Don't freak out about it and say, I don't know how I got into this situation. Because if you, I can tell you how to put it on a board, but there's reasons why you got there. And now you're there, and now you're transitioning. Give yourself some room to grow with the change of what's happening in your family. Grow with the change of what's happening, with your kids. I got this down here. Babies go from lying on their back to crawling. That's a transition. They're not where you left them. I remember one day I left one of my kids somewhere and thought, he's a little baby. He's just lying there. He'll be right. Sheree goes shopping. I watch television. Half an hour later, I think Sheree's coming home. I go back. Baby's gone. It's a transition. It's a transition for me. I started searching the house to find out where this little guy had got to, because they go from lying on their back to crawling around. They go from crawling around to walk, and they go from walking to talk, and they go from walking and talking to wrecking the house. These things change. There's transitions that happen all the time. And you know what? Out of the last couple of decades of me being a pastor, the amount of people I've had to walk through getting married, getting unmarried, going through divorce, losing a loved one, having a baby, seeing the baby grow and crawl and walk and talk. And that's not to mention from when they stay at home all day till they transition to their first day at school. First day at preschool is a big transition for a mum to let them go and realise that I'm not really sure what's going to happen. I just hope they're going to be there at 5 o'clock when I come back, and I trust, because I've read all the reviews of this daycare, that it's going to be all right. It's a big transition. Allow yourself grace to go through transitions. Things change. Things are always changing. In fact, when I think about this message, I'm thinking, wow, if we really understood this message, life would be a lot easier, because we realise things are going to change all the time. It changes when we grow from being kids to teenagers to adults, and all the stuff that I'm talking about. It's a big thing when you understand things just don't happen overnight. Sometimes you need to reach out to God and say, God, help me get through this transition. Help me just walk through this situation of living at home to now not living at home, even good relationship to a bad relationship, good friends to bad friends to no friends to a new friend, takes time. It's a transitional period. You know, I just this week, just yesterday, I think it was, I'm teaching Dallas, who's my little grandson, how to ride a push bike. And he's transitioning, just a transition, just no big deal. He's transitioning from a bike where he pushes with his legs on the ground to a bike where he's supposed to, pedal the pedals to make him go forward. And his mum said to me, hey, can you please help Dallas ride the bike? I'm going, yeah, I can help him ride the bike. I've taught 6 other people how to ride the bike. I can help him how to ride the bike. It'll be fine. He'll ride the bike. But it's a transition. He's going from pushing to pedaling. And I remember sitting him on the bike yesterday, and I put him on the seat, and he held the handlebars, and I put one foot on one pedal and the other foot on the other pedal, and I said, now push. And I pushed this knee down really, really hard, and he goes down, and then I push the other knee down really, really hard, and it goes down. I push the other, and it's like I'm bending over because he's only this high. I'm puffing more than he is, trying to push his legs down each side, helping him transition from riding a push bike where you push with your feet to a pedal bike where you push with the pedals. Did he get it? No. He thought he got it. He went up the hill slightly, put his foot on the pedals and rolled down the hill, and he goes, Pa, I did it. I'm going, no, you didn't do that. That's called gravity, son. That's not pedaling. But on the right track. Things are changing all the time. There's always things that are transitioning around our life. We're going from primary school to high school, from school to uni, or from school to a job. We might be going from one job to another job. We might be going from a single person to a boyfriend, to a best friend, to a marriage, to no friends. We could have our own kids. Parents are transitioning all the time from having kids to not having kids to having teenagers. Does anybody understand the transition as an adult here? Like, you're married and you have teenage kids. Do you remember the transition from when they were a kid and did everything you said to when they were a teenager and they did nothing you said? That's a transition. There's reasons why these transitions happen, but you need to know they're there, and you need to know they're happening and embrace them and ask God to help you get through these things. And then from teenage to adulthood is another massive transition. Listen to me, if you're an older person and you've got kids and you've got a teenage kid and they've turned 21 and they're turning into an adult, you can't treat them like a teenager anymore. You've got to love them regardless and let them make their own mistakes and let them make their own decisions. And when things go wrong, you've got to love them from a distance. If you don't transition with your own kids, you'll end up losing them and pushing them away, because one day they will grow up, make some mistakes, and they'll come back to you and say, Dad, how did you transition when you lost your wife? Or how did you transition when you got kids? Or how did you transition when mum had a baby? See, transition is a big deal, and the better we get at it, the more information we can pass down to the next generation of how to get through it. Things are transitioning all the time. Things are always changing. And when things change, please don't get scared. freak out and think it's the end of the world. Talking about the end of the world. The world is going through an incredible transition right now. That transition is how to live with COVID. And I'm more than happy to just speak about it. But I'm not here to speak about whether it's right or whether it's wrong. I'm not here to speak about whether COVID's real or not real, or whether the vaccine is good or bad, or whether it's a conspiracy or which conspiracy it might be. I'm not here to talk about any of that. I believe in free. My personal opinion is freedom of choice. You do your own research and you do what you think is right, and you stand on that dig of what you think is right. But the fact is, the world is going through transition of how to live with this, regardless of how we got it, how long it stays, or anything else of where it came from. We've got to learn to live with it. We've got to put our mask on when we come to church. It's a transitional period for the world. It's a transitional thing that's happening. And I want to tell you, we don't need to freak out about this stuff. It's okay to study it, learn it, have an opinion and everything else. But listen, this is my heart, and I said this 2 weeks ago. Do not let a transition that's happening to the world bring a division into the church. Because the moment your opinion about COVID separates you from someone else that you're sitting next to, not just in this church, any church, then you're really freaking out and lost the plot on what's going on. Because it's just the transition that we have to learn to live with. You just got to stand your ground and do what you think's right, but don't let it become a division in the church. Don't let it become a division in whether who's vaccinated and who's not vaccinated, or who believes this or who believes that. Listen, don't let division come into this church or anybody else you know, your friend, your school. And don't make it a divisive thing. It's just a change. It's just something that for whatever reason we have to walk through right now, and we have to let it know that we don't need to freak out and think it's the end of the world. Do you know what Luke said? I want to read this out to you. Luke said this in Luke chapter 21, verse 9. And you want to underline this one, especially if you're on the edge of, this is really bad and the whole world's going to die and freak out and there's major conspiracies. They will come. I'm not saying it's not real. I'm saying they will come. Look what Luke said. Luke said this: when you hear of wars, we've heard of wars. When you hear of uprisings, we've seen uprisings, don't be frightened. These things must happen first, but the end will not come right away. Then one will say to him, nation will rise against nation and kingdom against kingdom. There will be great earthquakes. Had one of them in Australia this week. There will be famines. There will be pestilence in various places and fearful events. So the Bible says there will be fearful events that we have to walk through. There's earthquakes, fearful events, famines, pestilence, nations, fighting, wars. But the Bible says all these things are going to happen. But it's not the end. They're all going to happen. Yes, there is going to be issues. Yes, there is going to be things to be fearful about. And yes, there is going to be things that potentially, without God, you would freak out. But Luke said, you will hear of all these things and all this stuff. And it says, do not be frightened. These things must happen first before the end will come. What did John say in 14? He said this, and this is another one worth underlining. It says in verse 27 or 14, peace, Jesus speaking, peace, peace, I live with you. I live with you. My peace I give to you. I do not give as the world gives. Do not let your hearts be troubled. Do not let your hearts be afraid. Listen, if that's the only takeaway you take from today, do not let your hearts be troubled. Do not let your hearts be afraid. Do not let the fearful events and the pestilence and the great earthquakes and the fighting and the wars and the rumors of wars and the fearful events take away the peace that you have because you're walking with God. That's why we're here. We're walking with God. And there's a transition that's happening in the world. Just another one. There'll be more. I watch the news. It changes nearly every night. Don't let your peace be stolen. Don't let fear grip you. Fear is not from God. Peace is from God. Freaking out is not from God. Peace is from God. God is not sitting up there on the throne going, oh my goodness, OMG, myself. I did not know this was going to happen. I did not know that China was going to do that, and America was going to do that, and people were going to do that, and Big Pharma was going to do that, and people were going to do that, and the state presidents were going to do that, and the national... I did, OMG, I've lost control. No. He says, peace. All this stuff's going to happen. There's going to be a lot of stuff that's going to go down. Oh, you just wait and see. This was written 2,000 years ago. There was stuff going down then, and there's stuff going down now. There's stuff going down in Afghanistan. There's stuff going down all around the world. There's stuff going down in the Western world. There's stuff going down in Queensland, Western Australia, everywhere. Peace. Peace. Things will change in the world. One day, there will be a cashless society. One day, there'll be people getting chipped to do things, to buy and sell, which the Bible says don't do. One day, things will go there. Is it heading towards all that? Of course it is. Luke said, hey, listen, all this stuff's going to happen. Fearful events, famines, earthquakes. There's going to be a whole bunch of stuff. But don't freak out. Have my peace. This is where your relationship with God really connects over the changes in your life. Do you know, I don't really want to, I don't want to talk about death or suicide and stuff like that. But, you know, people have taken their life over a marriage breakup. People have taken their lives over kids that haven't gone the way they thought, breakup. People have taken their lives over financial crises. People have taken their lives in the GFC happened. People have died through diseases and stuff that's happened. I'm not saying stuff doesn't happen. But see, as a Christian, put your eyes back on God. He said things are going to happen, but do not let your hearts be troubled. He said things are going to happen, but I'll give you peace, and ask for peace. And when you're going through a transition in your life, or whether the world's going through a transition in his life, you should sleep well because you know him. If you're not sleeping well, reconnect with God. And say, oh, I know God. No, listen, peace. Let's not cause a division over something that's changing in the world. Let's not cause division over someone's any choice or anything or whatever they may do or whatever they don't do. Let's keep our eyes on God. You know, some transitions don't freak people out. I'll give you one. And the band can sort of get ready to come right now, but just get ready. Here's a transition that doesn't freak people out. Do you realise that spring and autumn are transitions between summer and winter? Now you probably thought, I knew that, Mark. What do you take us for, a bunch of dummies? You know, we know that. Do you know that in the midst of winter, when it's freezing cold and there's frost on the ground and all the leaves have fallen off the trees and you know, you just like your bones are aching because you're cold, you don't freak out and say, I can't handle this anymore. If it gets any colder, I'm done. It's just going to get worse. It's going to get colder and colder and colder. You think it's cold now. You should see what I think. It's going to get colder, even colder than cold. And it's going to get so... No, we don't do that. You know why? Because we know that winters eventually go into springs. And the days get warmer. And the leaves start to sprout on the trees again. And, you know, sometimes we get pulled back to a cold day and then goes back to a warmer day. But I know that around about Christmas time, it's going to be so hot, I wish that, you know, we had a few cooler days. I wish we had 2 air conditionings and, you know, all this sort of stuff. Because we know that these seasons change and we've seen them every year. Every year since you've been alive, you've seen a summer, a winter, an autumn, and a spring. Big changes worldwide. People go from snow tires to the roof off the top of their car. People go from sitting in front of the fire to swimming in the ocean. It's extremes. But because we've seen these seasons change before and we know that God's got it on control, we just walk through that season. We just go, you know what? It's okay to walk through winter because summer's coming. And when it's stinking hot and summer's burning us and we get sun, it's okay. There'll be another winter that will come. And we're going to realize that seasons and transitions happen to all of us all the time. They happen to me personally. They happen to you. They happen to my marriage. They happen to my kids. They happen to my church. They happen to the world. They happen to the government. They happen to the worldwide government, whatever you want to call it. Stuff changes. But keep your eyes upon God. Some things don't freak us out because we've seen it happen before. Do you know another transition, and second last story, I promise, and then we're going to worship God. But just think of this before we go into worship. Giving birth. A baby goes from being inside of a woman's stomach to outside into the big, bad, wide world. That transition period it started, and 9 months later things are starting to change and things are starting to grow and the body's getting ready for it. But oh my goodness, that final transition between being inside and outside, it's rough. There's blood, there's guts, and there's gore. When I saw that, I pretty well freaked out with my first one, second, third, fourth, and sixth. It's just like, this is freaky. And yet, every woman that's ever given birth in the entire world for the last how many thousand years the world's been around has gone through something similar when they're given birth. And a lot of you women have done it because look how many people are in the world. But that transition's rough. I mean, no wonder the kid's crying when it comes out. No wonder the mum's crying. No wonder the dad's crying. The doctors are crying. Even God's probably crying. Look, how did that? What's going on between there and here? That's a crazy transition. And some transitions, I get it. They're messy. And there's blood and there's guts. And sometimes there'll be transitions like that in the world. Sometimes it'll be like that in your life, personal. But keep your eyes on God. This is my last story. Do you know what the biggest transition ever was? The biggest, most world-documented transition in history was when God changed from the law to grace. It is so well documented. There's an Old Testament that tells you a whole lot about it. Then there's a New Testament that tells you a whole lot about what happens after that transition. But that's not the big transition. The big transition was when God sent his son to earth. A transition from heaven to earth. And on that earth, he told us the way and told us that things would happen and told us how to get ready for stuff and blah, blah, blah. And then they put him on a cross. A transition of being a normal, lovely, sin-free person that's teaching people how to go forward and how to connect with God. And he transitioned from preaching on the mount to being nailed on a cross. Blood, guts, pain, gore, a whole bunch of stuff happened. Go watch Passion of the Christ if you think I'm making it up. A lot happened in that transition when Jesus Christ died on this earth. But that transition and that pain and what he went through was for one simple reason. So you could transition from not knowing God into knowing God. You could transition from, instead of living under the law, you could now live under his grace. And that transition changed the world forever. That transition changed my life forever. That transition changed this church forever. And out of all the transitions that have ever happened, both worldwide and personally and anywhere, that transition of Jesus coming from heaven to earth and then put on that cross so that we could go from the law to grace is a transition that every one of us should never, ever, ever let go. And because we're holding on to that transition, and because we're thanking him for that transition, and because we honor God for dying on us, and honor God for sending his son, and we thank Jesus for what he's done, listen to the words that he wrote in the midst of that transition. Things will happen. Things will change. Things will freak you out. There will be wars and rumors of wars and earthquakes and pestilence and strange things in the sky and strange things in the world. Government and a whole bunch of conspiracy stuff. He said, but listen, all of this is going to have to happen. And it's still not the end. It's just going to happen. So keep your eyes on me, because I've transitioned from heaven to earth so that you could walk from being scared into peace in whatever transition you find in your life. Amen?